I did have occasion to meet with officials at Philip Morris. Ellen Merlo was a leading member of the organization. We'd contacted one another through various superficial letters, I requesting a document such as an annual report, and she very politely sending it. And we kept in touch, and we would meet each other at the annual meetings and make small talk. And she did try to get me to go to lunch with her to talk about maybe there's a way that the anti-smoking people and Philip Morris could find some common ground. And didn't have any interest whatsoever in doing this except for intelligence purposes. And so I asked Ed Anselm, close colleague and physician in New York, and a doc member to join me, and he was very happy to do so. And we went to the Park Avenue building and went across the street to a restaurant where we had a pretty nice lunch. And I don't even recall very much about the lunch other than it was convivial and very nice. She was a real family person, very devoted to her family, not married. Really, Philip Morris was her life. And a lot of her portfolio was Marlboro. And she was, I believe, the Marlboro racing team's a PR person. But pretty amazing to meet the person whose life was given over to Marlboro. But in any event, she was very kind, and I even, as a joke, I asked, I joked with the people at Philip Morris that they taught me art because I'd been to so many of their art exhibitions, and that's how I collected all the catalogs. My favorite catalog was the Picasso Braque one, an incredible exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in the late 1980s that had the foreword in it by the head of Philip Morris, George Weissman. And this is what these catalogs have, by the way. Many of them actually have a page written by or ghostwritten by the head of Philip Morris in an art catalog. They don't do that anymore. They're a little bit more subtle. But at one time they had a full-time curator of the arts at Philip Morris, and of course the videos that we were able to get from J. Fred McDonald about their touting their sponsorship of the arts. But as I was joking with her about Philip Morris having taught me art, she said, would you like a couple of tickets for the ballet? And indeed, I did get a couple of tickets for the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, which was fabulous at City Center. Enjoyed it very, very much. So that's the extent to which you could say I took money or took in-kind funds from Philip Morris. But back on the activist front, in Houston, we organized a house call on the Marlboro Country Music Festival. And Tony Schwartz had done a commercial about the Marlboro Country Music Festival at Lincoln Center. And we got a small group out in front of this old theater, which is now a bookstore in Houston. And lo and behold, we arrived, just a few of us, and there was another group already picketing. And it turned out this was ACT UP protesting Philip Morris's support of Jesse Helms. So we joined each other, and we had a good time. I actually went in and heard the guitar concert, which was quite good, and had all the Marlboro paraphernalia that they were giving away. But that's a typical example of what they were sponsoring. Very few musicians over the years declined Philip Morris sponsorship. And John Stossel on ABC 2020 did reveal that the Oak Ridge Boys and Peter, Paul, and Mary had refused offers of cigarette companies to sponsor their concerts. And the Oak Ridge Boys and Peter, Paul, and Mary were interviewed in this story, and they won my undying affection and loyalty. This goes really back to the early 1980s when they saw the writing on the wall and they wanted nothing to do with the cigarette companies. The issue was very, very time-consuming. We have not only the largest archive in the world on this, but the only archive. And in the early 2000s, I got I did a workshop, a 3-hour seminar workshop at the National Conference on Tobacco or Health in Chicago, and also did a similar 1-hour presentation with others at a World Conference in Helsinki, Finland. And I've also addressed this issue at other national conferences on tobacco sponsors of the arts, I think 2 or 3 others. And in the early 2000s, not long after the Chicago conference, I received an email from Elizabeth Smith, or Libby Smith, at UCSF in San Francisco, asking if I would be on her committee or advisory committee for a grant that she was writing on tobacco sponsorship, to study tobacco sponsorship of the arts using tobacco industry documents. And I wrote back and I said, well, tell me more. And, who are you submitting it to, and what's this for, and what would my role be? And I didn't get very many details. All I got was, you'll be on our advisory committee and you will get a free trip to San Francisco for our advisory meeting. This didn't sit well with me. To the best of my knowledge, I wasn't the only one writing on this subject. There was a woman who had actually written a doctoral thesis on corporate sponsorship of the arts with, I'm sure, a good chunk of it devoted to Philip Morris. But I was rather stunned by this, and I contacted her and kept writing for more details. And finally she got a little annoyed and said, well, what do you want? You want some more money? Just tell me what you want. And I wrote and I said, but I think I've pretty much plumbed this issue to the depths that it can be plumbed. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of industry documents with contracts with the agencies, but really everything that they did was out in front. That's what I monitored. I monitored their actual sponsorship of the arts. I don't know what more you're going to expect to find. She says, well, we want to do the seminal paper on the subject, as if all the house calls that we had done in Doc and all the op-eds I had done, one in the Houston Press called Museum Malignancy, as if the work that Doug Minkler and I had done to produce the Artist as Ashtrays poster, where I wrote the copy to parody a cigarette-sponsored art exhibition advertisement that Philip Morris was taking out left and right in the 1980s and 90s. In fact, the slogan that Philip Morris went by was, "It takes art to make a company great." And we parodied that by saying it takes art to make complacency great. And I related this to her, and still couldn't get to first base as to where this was being submitted and exactly whether I could see the proposal before it was being submitted. And finally, she wrote me an email and said, okay, what do you want? $25,000 a year for 5 years, which is what I had jokingly written to her. She said, fine, you'll get it. Well, that made me wonder what kind of grant this was. I mean, this must have been one of the $1 million National Cancer Institute grants that were being given out at that time to study tobacco industry documents. I was floored. And I thought, as much as I thought this was important, to justify this kind of money going into studying industry documents of stuff that was already well done. And by this point, they were winding down. I think it was less than a year later that Philip Morris actually announced it was leaving New York City and thus would end all of the arts sponsorship grants. But in a nutshell, that's really, unfortunately, a point about how we've gone about this issue, whereas Doc would get out in the streets and rally the troops and make fools of ourselves in a way, but get some attention and publicity, and even in the New York Times, to expose the use of the arts by cigarette companies, something that should never have gone together. And meanwhile, other people would sit behind their desk, type up a grant, and get $1 million to study it. That, to me, is the story of tobacco control.